Good afternoon. I'm Sue Hoxie. I am part of the New England Federation of Humane Societies, and welcome to this session of the 2021 annual conference. So this session is being sponsored by the Animal Rescue League of Boston. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. There are some interactive tools on the right side of your screen. There's a group chat field and a Q&A tab. If you have any questions during the session, you can submit them via the Q&A tab. This session is being recorded and will be available for later viewing. 15 minutes after the completion of each session, certificates will be automatically emailed to everyone who has been in attendance for 60 minutes or more. Any questions regarding acceptance of CEUs should be directed to the authority who grants credits for your organization or state. Lastly, at the end, we will be keeping the session open for 15 minutes for anyone who'd like to join the screen or stay in the chat to continue discussing this presentation or for general networking. If you'd like to participate, just stay in the session when it ends. So Amanda Arrington is the Senior Director of the groundbreaking Pets for Life program at the Humane Society of the United States and previously served as a lobbyist and North Carolina State Director for HSUS. With PFL, Amanda gives a social justice-driven approach to create equity in and access to pet resources and information for people in underserved communities. Under her leadership, the program has been implemented in over 50 markets across the country and is working to make companion animal welfare a more just and inclusive movement. Amanda is also the founder and executive director for Beyond Fences, a nonprofit based in Durham, North Carolina. The organization builds trust and relationships by providing no-fee pet services and support for people living in underserved neighborhoods. Amanda has received many awards for her community outreach work, including the prestigious American Veterinary Medical Association's Humane Award in 2018. Amanda serves as co-chair of the Association for Animal Welfare Advancement's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. So now I'll turn it over to our speaker. Away you go, Amanda.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. I want to start out by saying that as I share my screen in this platform, I cannot see the Q&A or the chat as the presentation is going along, so I will look at those after. I want to encourage everybody to please put in any questions or comments or just thoughts that you have as we go along, and we'll look at those after the presentation, but just want everyone to know that I'm unable to see them as I'm speaking and as my screen is being shared, the PowerPoint is being shared with you. So I won't see those until the end. And then I know there's also the option for you to unmute yourself and I think even be on video and ask questions at the end too. And so if you're like me, it might be more difficult to articulate your thoughts or to form your questions in writing. So if at the end you would like to share your screen and unmute yourself and have a conversation that way, I encourage that as well. I always like it when we can't be together in person, if we can make this as interactive as possible and try to create what we would be able to if we were in the same room. So again, just please don't be shy and ask questions or share your thoughts as we go along. As Sue said, I am Amanda Arrington. I'm the Senior Director of the Pets for Life program at HSUS. And I'm happy to be able to share our work with you. This is my first time presenting at the New England Federation Conference, so it'll be nice to talk with you a bit about our work in Pets for Life and the connection between animal welfare and social justice. So PFL was created at HSUS to increase equity in access to pet resources for people and pets living in poverty and in underserved communities. We're working hard every day for ourselves and really for the movement at large to create a philosophical shift to where we are considering and working to better understand larger issues of racial and economic injustice, how animal welfare has been complicit in or even directly contributed to systems of oppression and discrimination. And then how do we begin to disrupt and to dismantle those systems, both within animal welfare as an industry and with society at large, by increasing community-based programming and pet owner support services? So there are three main areas for our Pets for Life work. I want to give you a little background on the program first, before we get into some of the topics about social justice specifically. All of these areas of our work, they're individually important, but they overlap for us in our efforts to tackle access to care from both a micro and a macro level. So we have direct care programming in two communities in Los Angeles and Philadelphia. In these two markets, we have our own staff who are operating community outreach programs. So they are out in the communities every day, different since COVID, hopefully soon to resume normal operations, but out in communities, building trust and relationships and community partnerships. We provide spay neuter, wellness care, urgent quality of life veterinary care, pet supplies like crates and litter boxes, other services like pet fees, behavior training, all at no cost to people and their pets. The largest footprint of our work, however, is our mentorship and training. We want to make it possible for local organizations to incorporate community outreach and pet owner support work into their core missions. So we provide financial support and in-depth training to our mentorship partners around the country. And then the third area is one that we'll talk quite a bit about today, and it may seem a bit more nebulous, but it's a really necessary and impactful part of our work. And that's through research partnerships and data collection, the creation of industry tools. We're working to provide resources for animal welfare on how do we make our movement more just and inclusive. So you can see here where the program has been operated and is in operation. It's been in over 50 communities across the U.S. and Canada so far. And the work is carried out by all types of local organizations, open admission or municipal shelters, limited admission or private shelters, some non-sheltering groups like spay neuter clinics or community medicine clinics, and then even some non-animal welfare organizations, specifically in some Native communities with Native-led agencies operating the program. And it's in all types of communities. You can see in all regions of the country, from the Pacific Northwest to the Midwest to the South to New England, and in different types of communities, large cities like Seattle and Boston, rural communities in Idaho and Alaska, and Native communities in Minnesota and Montana. And we've been quite deliberate in having variety in the locations and with the types of groups that we work with, so that we are able to really pull together best practices and show that a human-centered approach works no matter where you are or what type of organization you're with. And so to date, the program and all those communities that you saw on the map has served over 225,000 pets. In that, we've provided over 135,000 spay-neuter surgeries at no cost to people. And because we are more than a spay-neuter program and really make a concerted effort to listen to the community's perspective and to hear what it is that the community wants and needs for their pets, we've provided over 684,000 supplies, medications, and other services for people and their pets. And so in all of those communities and all of those people and pets that we've met, we actually collect the exact same set of data. And that has now given us a really strong snapshot of what it means to be a pet owner living in poverty or in an underserved area. I want to share a few of those sort of top line metrics of what we've collected. So to date, of those pets that we've met, when we've met them, about 88% of the pets were unaltered when we met. That's a pretty stark number on its own, but if you're familiar at all with a couple of national surveys that happen every year from the AVMA and from the APPA, the exact opposite is actually true for owned pets in the U.S., where close to 90% of owned pets are altered. And so this shows us that in the communities where we're focusing, in these pockets that exist in every single community, where there are high rates of poverty and little to no access to pet resources, these are the areas for us to really invest our time, energy, and resources. And then of all of those pets that we've met, a majority of them, almost 3 out of 4, have never seen a veterinarian before for any reason at all. That's not just for spay-neuter. That's for any preventative care, wellness care. People just don't have relationships with the veterinarian. And then of the people of the pets who have seen a vet, most of those have been for emergency type situations. And then this stat, I think, is really important for all of us as service providers, and who I think most of you are, who are attending in organizations that you represent, that you're providing a pet service or resource in some way to the community. Because what this tells us is that, again, in underserved areas, the majority of pet owners have never reached out to their local shelter, animal control, animal service agency. And so it's really an audience of pet owners that has not historically been reached by us in animal welfare, and that we have work to do in building relationships with people in communities that have been underserved. And there are a lot of reasons for this statistic. Everyone is an individual, so there are different reasons for every person, but a few that we see come up regularly are that, one, people just didn't know that the services existed. So again, looking at how are we messaging, how are we connecting? Some people do know about the services, but are unsure or afraid of connecting, afraid of getting into trouble, potentially afraid of being embarrassed or made to feel bad, afraid of their pet being taken from them. So there's a lot of work for us to do when we're looking at this audience of pet keeping, and how do we really work to bridge the divide and start to build the trust that's needed. And so one of the things that we have asked ourselves in Pets for Life, and that we have taken time to really consider, is why are these numbers what they are? How did this come to be? And where we've arrived at is a place of realizing how important it is for animal welfare to have context of larger systems and structures, and how the work of companion animal welfare really necessitates a consideration of the human condition. And we've done so many things well in animal welfare over the last few decades. We've made huge strides for animals. In fact, we've brought animals into very sharp focus. That dog or the cat or the other companion animals, birds, rabbits, they're seen much more clearly. And that's because of all of our hard work. But what we now need to do, and what we're proposing in Pets for Life, is that we need to bring the entire picture into focus. And that doesn't mean making the animal any less seen or putting the animal in the background. It just means growing awareness of the person that the animal is connected to, and the environment that the animal exists in, the community that the animal is a part of. And when we have that clearer focus and that greater clarity, then we are not only more effective in the work and reaching our goals, but we're more equitable in our work as well. So I want to talk about some of the ways in which social justice intersects with animal welfare, and how our work is sort of intrinsically a part of social justice. There are layers and layers of inequities and oppression in every facet of our society. And because those inequities impact people, they therefore impact their pets. And these are layers that I'm sure most of you are likely familiar with in some form, but we still feel that it's important to call out, to name, and to really start to look at the connection to animal welfare. So I'm going to go through some of these layers that have informed our work in Pets for Life, and that we hope, and that we're seeing really, especially in the last year, more and more are informing animal welfare overall. So poverty is unfortunately pervasive in the U.S. Over 43% of the population is low income or working poor. That's around about 140 million people. And this was before COVID. COVID has forced millions of more people into poverty. And while socioeconomics alone is essential to understand, we can't talk about poverty without also talking about race and ethnicity in this country. The two are just inextricably linked. And as you can see here, a much higher rate of Latino, Black, and Native people live in poverty in the country than do white people. There's also a significant racial wealth gap where the average white person has about 10 times the wealth of Latino and Black Americans. And wealth is more than just income. It's the full spectrum of someone's financial worth. And so in real terms, wealth impacts everything from sending your kids to college, the ability to care for aging parents, if you can buy a home, and so much more, including access to pet resources. Economists actually estimate that about 80% of lifetime wealth accumulation depends on where a person starts and then intergenerational transfers of wealth. So advantage in wealth is literally passed down from generation to generation. And so what that means is that the current wealth gap, we have to look back. It really is decades, if not centuries in the making. And so we can't ignore that foundation of wealth that has been created for white people, and again, how that has gotten us to where we are today with that disparity that you saw in the previous slide. And so just a couple of things to sort of look back on that are oftentimes sort of viewed as, well, that's in the past. We need to, forget about it, or we need to look forward and move on. But it really is important to sort of understand the foundation. About $1 trillion of profit was gained from the hundreds of years of human enslavement. And then there was a massive wealth that was gained when taking land from Native people. The Homestead Act alone, which is one of the greatest wealth transfer programs in the country's history. Today, still nearly 50 million American adults are direct descendants of people who were beneficiaries of the Homestead Act. And unfortunately, again, the wealth gap is only growing more severe, with white wealth far outpacing that of Black and Latino people over the last 30 years. And because there's no one reason for the disparities, that means there's also no one solution to remedying those disparities, because our entire system has been built on this inequity. And that's why we believe animal welfare can't ignore the impact on our work or our role in understanding and then affecting change. And so this is just one example of that I wanted to share. You can see the difference here in wealth that still exists when controlling for education. So on the left, you can see that white Americans with less than a high school education still have more wealth than Black and Brown Americans do with a college degree, shown on the right. So when we think, well, if we just fix this one area, if we just make education more equitable, that will solve the problem. This shows that that's simply not true, that it really is a multifaceted and multi-layered issue. And so because there are many reasons for the racial wealth divide, I wanted to highlight just one of those that I think is of particular significance. One, because it's where we can start to see sort of clear and distinct correlations between policymaking of the past and then present day outcomes, but also where we can see a direct connection to animal welfare. And that's in home ownership. I'm sure that you've all heard about or you're familiar with the New Deal. Maybe you haven't studied it since high school, or maybe you remember all the details of it. But it is the program that was created by the government to help the U.S. recover from the Great Depression. It was the largest welfare program to date in our country's history, even more than the current stimulus package. And a major piece of the New Deal was government-backed mortgages. And so before the New Deal, home ownership was much more limited for people because you had to provide about 50% down on a home, and then you could only have the rest of the loan over 5 to 10 years. So there weren't as many people who had that opportunity. And so what the New Deal did is it opened up home ownership to tens of millions of people by offering little to no down payments for people and home loans over 30 years. And in today's dollars, about $2 trillion was provided for home ownership support through the New Deal. Unfortunately, about 98% of the recipients of that were white. And so the way that the mortgages were provided and approved was through a national appraisal system that was set up in towns and cities around the country. And that guided where the government-backed funds would be given. So in that appraisal system, the areas that were deemed hazardous, where mortgage support would not be provided, those areas were marked in red. And this became known as redlining. Those communities were predominantly Black and brown communities. And so white people through this program were given an opportunity and provided an advantage that people of color were kept from for generations and building that generational wealth. And so this government sanctioned policy of the 1930s, it's not just something of the past. It really set up the racial and economic segregation that we still see today and that determines so many outcomes for people, including the availability and accessibility of pet resources and pet services. And it's why it shouldn't be a surprise that housing insecurity and issues with housing is one of the top reasons why people surrender their pets to shelters. So a study was done in 2018 that looked at the redlining that occurred in 1937 and 1938. And what it showed is how just long-lasting and far-reaching the impacts of that has been and still is on people today. And what it showed is that about 3/4 of the neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s are still the most economically disadvantaged communities today, and that the majority of those communities are still predominantly inhabited by Black and brown families today. And then conversely, that the vast majority of the areas that did receive that government support are the middle to upper class communities today and are still mostly white. And this is, again, what we see in just about every single community in the country, where there are areas of concentrated poverty and resource deserts for all sorts of things, from human to human health care and food, but also pet resources. And because the practice of redlining impacted so many communities and had such a profound, lasting effect, we wanted to pull just a couple of quick examples to share in New England. And in particular, to show that the issue isn't just a large city issue, that really just about every single community had an impact in some way. So you can see here, this is the redlining map, the actual map from 1938 in Waterbury, Connecticut. And the red areas are the ones that are marked as hazardous. The gold are the ones that are declining. And so these are areas where the mortgage support through the New Deal were not provided. And then you can see here the community today by household income. And so that lowest income area where the average household makes $25,000 or less is mostly the area that was redlined in the 1930s. And then another example, in Massachusetts, again, same thing. You can see that the red areas are those marked as hazardous, the gold being the areas that were declining, where the mortgage support wasn't given. And then again today, that those are the areas that still have the highest concentration of people with the lowest incomes. And so when home ownership is made difficult or impossible, then renting is the only option. And the challenges that exist for low-income renters are extreme. So this is a map that shows there's not a single state in the country that has a sufficient supply of affordable and available housing for low-income renters. So the numbers that you see corresponding with the colors, those are how many rental homes there are available for every 100 low-income families. And so some of the New England states definitely fare better than states in other regions. but still every state comes up short in providing stable and secure housing for low-income people. And again, to keep pointing out, this does not take into account the economic devastation of COVID and the sort of pending eviction crisis that we've all been worried about and thinking about for months now. And this definitely does not take into consideration pet-friendly, affordable housing. And so, as we've discussed, a person's income and a person's wealth dictates and it has a huge influence on where someone lives and whether someone owns or rents. And with the public education system in our country being structured mostly around property taxes, what that also means is that there is an impact on where and how children are educated. And so you can see here the result of that in children of color going to high poverty schools at a much higher rate than white children. Oppression and discrimination is also ever present in law enforcement, where in study after study and just about every task force and every investigation that's been conducted, there's been shown to be racial implications in every facet of the criminal legal system. And this is, again, just one example of that from the Department of Justice that shows how white and Black Americans use and sell drugs at almost exactly the same rates, but Black people are subjected to drug arrest at more than double the rate of white people. And again, just the connection to animal welfare, we see really clearly that because animal welfare has an enforcement component and often is in a position of authority, it's imperative for us as a field to recognize the differences in experience and engagement with enforcement that communities of color have, and the implicit bias that can also exist in animal policing. We would be naive to think that in all of these other areas there are these disparities, but that somehow in animal welfare we are exempt from this bias in our policy making and our enforcement. And so it's something that we think is just really necessary for us to look at and to always seek to understand and sort of view our work through this perspective of equity and inclusion. And so naturally, all of these areas lead to a very imbalanced rate as well of incarceration, which has such significant destabilization of families and of entire communities and a negative impact on people and their pets. So you can see here the percent of the U.S. population by race and ethnicity compared to the percent of the prison population. Okay, one final set of data. This is the rate at which we spend taxpayer dollars for educating children versus incarcerating people. And so every state, you can see, spends more on punishment, those are the blue dots, than on education, the orange dots. And I just put a few highlights in of the states that I think many of you may be from, so you can kind of see the differences in that spending. This is not only a question of what is valued in our society, but we see it as another direct parallel to animal welfare and how we invest in our work. If we plotted our spending in animal welfare similarly to this between reactive work and proactive work, we would probably see something similar where there's less money being spent on support services. And so again, just something for us to all think about and consider, and how do we start to transition to increasing equity in pet services to where we're providing more support and more resources to people for their pets instead of reactive sheltering and punitive measures. So there are many ways to take all of this information and to make efforts in animal welfare to not only affect change within our field, but use our work to contribute to issues of equity more broadly as well. And so I wanted to talk about just one of those areas today. There are many things that we can do, but one that I thought would be really interesting to talk about with you all and to highlight is how we create narratives and communicate within animal welfare, and how through that we can begin to move the needle through our messaging and through our fundraising and how we garner support. The stories that we tell in animal welfare, the messages that we spread, they really matter. And I shared this sort of one area in part because I struggle on it within my own organization sometimes, and definitely have in the past, around support and around fundraising. I think that it's a pretty common flaw in our movement, that what we've used to make money and to create sort of a sense of urgency in giving is to have a villain and to set up this us versus them mentality of help us save animals from horrible people. And there's no doubt that has worked. It's very effective, but we want to think about at what cost. And then also ask, until we earnestly try something different, can we say that other methods don't work as well, and other methods that wouldn't have maybe unintended consequences? And until recently, I don't think as a whole animal welfare has been very active in seeking out that understanding of institutional discrimination and how that is a part of our work. And maybe haven't even stopped to think about how we've benefited from negative labeling and from divisiveness. You all have probably either said some of these things or heard them from colleagues. I know that I have, but statements like, if you can't afford a pet, you shouldn't have one, or we have to educate some people on how to be responsible pet owners. Those people obviously don't love their dog because it lives outside, or the only way to get certain people to spay and neuter is to make it a law. And so we think that it's extremely unfair to create this very narrow definition of what compassion must look like, and then label anyone who falls outside of that as a bad person or as the enemy. And that in that, we often are perpetuating stereotypes that really sort of maintain that division, and in the long run are really harmful to people and their pets. So if you go on social media pages around animal welfare conversations and issues, you're likely to find discussions that can be really hateful and that can be really derogatory. And this picture is just one example. And this picture is posted about a dog with a medical issue and asking for support. And this is all that you see, then you're likely to get these kinds of responses. What often, or too often, happens is that the story is framed with a very limited perspective. We're only telling one part of the story. And then whether we fill in the blanks with dangerous assumptions, or we're just okay with providing the opportunity for the public to fill in those blanks. The message can either be explicit or imply, that this dog was not taken care of, this dog was not loved, or even worse, that someone intentionally harmed this dog and maliciously let the dog suffer. And so many times that language is coded and just can bring with it so many problems and harm. And so what we're wanting all of us to sort of stop and think about is, how can we be more accurate in our representation? Like in this photo, this is the full photo. This is the full story. And so how do we sort of garner support by telling this full story, one that honors the love that people have for their pets and tells a much more nuanced truth of systemic inequity and access to pet resources? And so we hope that we can, sort of take steps to move away from that approach that relies on demonizing people and sort of the separation. And so how do we work on changing that narrative? I'll share a few ideas and suggestions, but again, I hope that maybe there's things happening in the chat that I can't see, or that people will have thoughts later. But in addition to what we'll talk about today, we have a guide that we created in Pets for Life called our Sustainability Guide. And we worked on for about 1.5 years and hired an outside consultant that would really sort of go through the steps of not just fundraising, but communication and strategic planning and fundraising around community outreach and pet owner support work. And so if you're interested in that, it's for free online. If you go to humanepro.org, you can go there and there's a Pets for Life page, but you can also go to humanepro.org/Pets for Life /sustainability guide. And I'll put the link in the chat in a bit. But it, again, just sort of takes you individually or organizationally sort of step by step through a lot of these conversations and gives things that you can do with your colleagues, exercises, more learning. So just to cover a few of the points today, though, cultural humility is really one of the more important places to start. So cultural humility is the practice of looking inward and examining implicit bias that we all have by nature of being human beings. And cultural humility is this essential ingredient in valuing other viewpoints and creating honest and fair narratives out to the public. It again focuses on introspection and sort of this ongoing process of self-exploration and self-critique, and being willing to listen and learn from other people. And it also it's an active acknowledgement in power and privilege dynamics, and then how we can break those down. And then with language, we I think probably all agree that language can be really powerful. And so therefore it's necessary for us to be thoughtful and deliberate in the language that we use. And that there may be certain words or phrases that are common in animal welfare, but that can be interpreted or misinterpreted. And that there's a tone oftentimes that comes along with the language that is used. One example that I mentioned earlier is around education, or like the role of educating people on their pets. Most of the time, there's nothing negative that's meant by using that word education. But the way that it can come across and what it can imply is that we in animal welfare are unequivocally right, that we have the only answer and know the only way that something can be done, and that it creates this hierarchy where the person who is doing the educating holds the power and is above people who are being educated. So just thinking through some of those terms and the language that are pretty common in animal welfare. And then, looking at how we tell the stories that can focus on the positive. One of the big lessons we learned in Pets for Life when we started working with the Institute for the Human-Animal Connection that lives in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver, working with social workers really helped us to see how to become more asset focused and not deficit focused as far as individuals that we serve. And so instead of sort of bringing it to this place of like blaming individual people, really being able to highlight systems and institutions that if we want to sort of stick with that formula of having a villain, the villain is poverty, or the villain is inequity. The villain is not the individual. So I think probably many of these ideas and beliefs, we all already have in animal welfare, but oftentimes where the work is needed is just around internal communication for leadership to set clear expectations with staff on what to highlight and how to do that. And then for departments to talk to each other and to share stories and to have really, really strong connection between the work that the different parts of an organization may be carrying out. And again, this is where we've struggled a bit at HSUS, that we've had inconsistency sometimes between our departments and our programs. And I've seen through my own organization firsthand how a positive message in one area can be undermined or canceled out with a negative message in another area. And it may sound a bit oversimplified, but really building in some basic accountability measures can be very, very helpful, of having a checklist of questions that you ask yourselves or you ask of your coworkers before every social media post, or just having regular staff conversations on the evolution of your messaging, checking in on what sort of response are you getting back from the public and from your supporters through different types of communication and promotion. And then just not underestimating your donors. Some of your supporters may need patience and time for you to walk through this information, because it's different from what a lot of us have, the way in which we've communicated and shared before. There's been a public expectation in a lot of ways that's been built up over years, if not decades. And so it could take some time to make some shifts and to make some of those changes. But it is possible. And I wanted to give you, again, an example from within our program and our work at HSUS. So in 2016, HSUS was choosing a program to sort of be highlighted and be the recipient of the Day of Giving, if any of you have participated in the Day of Giving each year. Pets for Life was chosen that year, and we spent about 2 months working with our communications team and building out the campaign. And it was going to be on social media. It would go out in text messages and emails, through all of the different platforms that we use to communicate with people. And we had a bit of a struggle in the beginning when we were creating the campaign around, one, all of our imagery. We wanted it to be of people with their pets. We really wanted to highlight that bond. We didn't want to just have a dog or just have a cat, which was something that was pretty common. So that was one sort of big shift, to always have a person that was represented in the imagery, but then also to not have any sort of negativity around people. And so it was pretty new for our national team to talk about pet resource deserts, to use graphics and highlighting issues of transportation and financial limitations, and how we talked about that as a systems issue and not an individual fault. And so we worked through all of that, and our goal was, over a 24-hour period for the Day of Giving time period, to raise $150,000. A lot of people weren't sure that was going to be possible because, again, it was sort of new and different messaging for our audience. Well, we ended up exceeding that quite a bit. We raised over $500,000 in that 24-hour period. But what was really exciting and sort of helped open up some really important conversation within our organization is that over 40% of the people who gave were first-time donors. And at the time, that was the highest rate of first-time givers that we had. And so it sort of helped us make the case and start to build in some of that comfort that there are people who haven't supported animal welfare before who'd be really interested in supporting other human beings and sort of community betterment and those sorts of things. So, these things take time, but I wanted to share that as just an example. So some of you may already be making some of these changes, or it's just always been a part of who you are to talk about the positive and to highlight the bond between people and their pets. But I know for some, it's not easy, and it's tough, and it's going to take time to figure out how to do that in a way that fits with your organization. And so I want to end, before we open up for some questions and conversation, with a few questions that we started asking ourselves a decade ago in Pets for Life, and that we think is really important for every organization to ask, and for us as a field overall to be asking. Where have we been complicit, and where have we directly participated in holding up institutional inequity in our work? Through our laws, through our policies, through our programming, Are we punishing people for economic circumstances that are created by these larger systems? And are we criminalizing people living in poverty? And then how can we make animal welfare more inclusive of all people, of all perspectives, and really value different experiences? And then knowing the current systems and looking at all the inequities that we talked about, since it's taken centuries to create, are we committed to the long-term work that's going to be needed in order to make real change? Now more than ever, we have this moral imperative in animal welfare, one that values and invests in support services and creating equity and access to pet resources, one that extends our compassion beyond the animals and to the people who are connected to those animals. And we have to become intersectional in animal welfare to really carry out our work in collaboration and in partnership, not just with partners within animal welfare, but other partners working on community engagement issues of equity, social justice. And we know that when we honor the love that people have for their pets, and we ensure that people have access to what they want and need for their pets, then we're not just of service to the animals, but we're also of service to people in the community as well. And so we believe that there is this universal love of and connection to animals. And so that gives us this really special and unique opportunity in animal welfare, and one that we believe is really important for us to take hold of, and an obligation for us to respond to. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and see if we have any questions. Okay, so I'm looking at the Q&A and there's nothing in there, but I see some activity in the chat.
Yeah, no questions in the Q&A right yet. Questions about whether attendees will be able to get the slides. Are you making those available?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. We're working out on the New England Fed side how to make those slides available, not just for this presentation, but for others.
Okay. Yes, so however I need to send those, I am happy to share those with everyone. And I was going to mention too, what I can also share of however this will get disseminated to attendees, but we've created a resource list that provides, again, if just in your spare time, because I know all of you have all of this extra time, if you want to read any books, listen to any podcasts, look at research and studies, we have all of that compiled together in a sort of easy way too that we'll share out with everybody.
Okay, so there is somebody in the participation, Athenia Kennedy. Can you hear us, Athenia?
Can everyone hear me?
Oh, there we go.
I see somebody. Oh, it's so nice to see another face.
So I guess a big question that I have regarding all of this, and something that I've noticed in my organization, it's a constant conversation that is happening, and I'm fairly new to animal welfare. I've been here only a year and a half, but we serve a community of like a lot of Latinx people, a large Black community, lots of people in poverty, and we have a lot of resources to help people, or we're trying to maintain those resources for people to stay with their pets, yet like our adoption fees are completely out of reach for those people in that community, so they can't get animals through us because our adoption fees are so high. But with those fees, it's how we are able to support the program. So it's very, how do you strike a balance, I guess, is like my question that I'm always like, I don't know the solution. I don't know how to bring this up to like people higher up, but like that is unfortunately the community that we do serve.
Yeah. I don't know if it makes you feel any better, but I don't think you're alone in this. I think that this is one of those areas so many organizations are grappling with, and looking at how to not have one area of your work that actually contributes negatively in another area, but then you have a program that responds to that, and it sort of becomes this cycle. And so I think it's a real problem in part because of the structure of shelters historically. You know, for the longest time, shelters were needed as, you know, sort of this safety net for animals. But I think we're at a moment in time where the future is looking quite different. In some places, the present looks very different. And so those sort of fee structures and those organizational models worked maybe years ago, but aren't necessarily reflecting the reality today. So I think there's a lot of restructuring that has to be done, but that is at an organization level, and it varies, of course, within every single community. So I don't think that there's like this one sort of magic bullet answer. Unfortunately, if I had that, I think that I'd be in a very different position because I would just have the magic answer for everybody. But I think it's just doing the really hard work, quite honestly, of sitting down and saying, okay, what have we not changed that we need to? What are we missing? How do we reallocate? Because that's where a lot of it happens that we've seen in our PFL mentorship partners. Is a combination of diversifying your donor base. And so not just going back sort of to the same animal welfare supporters, but really making your organization and your programming relevant to people who aren't traditional animal welfare supporters. Like in the big sort of philanthropic pie, animals in the environment are less than 5% of that. And so there's a lot more of an audience to be gained when we're talking about how we serve people and how our work benefits people. So there's that focus of like, how do we bring in new supporters? How do we bring in new revenue streams? But then it's also about how do we reallocate? How do we shift from some of our work that is reactive and turn that into proactive, even if it's just piece by piece? We're not going to do that overnight, but like, can you siphon off, you know, like one part-time position that starts to do something different than what's been done before? So those are the two ways that we've broken it down with our groups and looked at sort of each organization as its own entity, looked at its budget, looked at the community that it's a part of, what is the giving capability, and said, okay, where can we bring in new funds that can offset and start to do some of the fee reductions, but then also how can we sort of redefine the organization and start to do a reallocation? And I don't know, I mean, that's not an exact answer for your question, but I think that what you're asking too, the sustainability guide really goes into so much detail, so much more than what we have time to. And it provides a lot of opportunity to do exercises and to kind of work it through for your individual organization. It's a little bit long. It's very comprehensive. It's a 4-chapter guide. But if you take a look at it, I think that could give maybe some ideas for your specific leadership of how to start the conversation or how to, you know, have some staff meetings around some of these issues.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming on camera. It makes me so happy to see someone.
Yeah, I did not know how to put this into text, and I am one-handed right now.
I'm the same way. I really can't. I can't ask things in writing. I can't get the thoughts out. I'm much better verbally. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Anybody else with a question?
Anybody else brave enough to go on camera? Or if you're more comfortable, please feel free to type it into the chat if you would like.
All right. Going once, twice. All right. We'll call it a day. So thank you, Amanda, for your presentation today. And thank you to all of you for attending the session. I put a link to a post-session survey that's been posted in the group chat. So if you'd take a few moments and fill that out, we'd greatly appreciate it. And this session concludes our 2021 conference. So thank you to everyone who attended our very first virtual conference. All of the sessions will be available to watch on demand following the conference. So thank you. And now we do have some questions.
Okay.
Okay. Sue, you tried to get on stage, but it isn't connecting. I believe the feature is only available to people with cameras and mics. So if you don't have that capability. And Mike is asking, can he email a question to you, Amanda? What's the best way to do that?
Sure. My email is Arrington, so AARRINGTON @humanesociety.org.
Great. Okay. Thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next year. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.